Illyra Vane stood at the edge of her father's study, listening through a crack in the door, as two men decided her future. One voice belonged to her father, tired and broken. The other belonged to a royal tax collector, cold and impatient. "The debt must be paid," the collector said. "The crown has already been generous. King Draven has offered to take your daughter into his court instead of seizing your land. You should be thanking him." Illyra's stomach twisted. She had heard the stories, like everyone else in the kingdom of Valemore. King Draven Ashwolf, the Wolf King, was said to be a man without mercy. Villages that resisted his rule were burned. Rivals who challenged him disappeared. Even his own court feared him, it was whispered, more than they feared war itself. And now she was being given to him, like a piece of furniture passed from one owner to another. Her father did not look at her when she stepped into the room. He simply said, "It is decided," and turned away. 3 days later, Illyra rode north in a covered carriage, watching the green hills of her home fade into gray stone and colder air. By the time the towers of Valemore Castle rose above the frozen tree line, she had stopped crying. There was no use in tears where she was going. The castle was enormous and silent, its halls lined with banners bearing a snarling wolf. Servants moved quickly and spoke quietly, eyes low, as though the walls themselves might report their words to the king. Illyra was led to a small chamber and given plain gray clothing, the color worn by every woman brought to court to be considered as a possible bride for the king. She was not the only one. There were 4 others, all pale with worry, all clearly there against their will, sold or traded away by families desperate for coin or protection. None of them spoke much. What was there to say? That evening, Illyra finally saw him. King Draven entered the great hall in a black coat trimmed with silver, his expression unreadable. He was younger than she expected, with sharp eyes and a jaw set tight, as though he were always holding something back. He walked past the row of women, without truly looking at any of them, said a few clipped words to his advisor, and left. It was over in less than a minute. Illyra realized she had been holding her breath the entire time. "He is even colder than they say," whispered one of the other girls beside her. Illyra said nothing, but something about the moment bothered her, though she could not say what. The days that followed fell into a strange rhythm. Illyra was given small duties, arranging flowers in the Eastern Hall, delivering messages between servants, tasks meant to keep the brides-to-be occupied and out of the way. She kept mostly to herself, speaking only to Mira, a young handmaiden who had been kind to her from the first day. "Everyone is afraid of him," Mira admitted one night, as she helped Illyra braid her hair. "But I've served in this castle for 2 years, and I confess, some things do not add up." "What do you mean?" Mira lowered her voice. "Last winter, a servant boy broke a vase worth more than his family's entire farm. Everyone expected him to be thrown out, or worse. Instead, the king paid for the damage himself and told the boy to be more careful next time. That is not the act of a man without mercy." Illyra frowned. Perhaps he simply didn't feel like punishing a child that day. "Perhaps," Mira said, "but there are other things too. There is a room on the 3rd floor, at the end of the west corridor. It is always locked. No servant is allowed near it. Rumor says it is where the king keeps instruments of punishment for those who displease him." A chill ran through Illyra, but curiosity stirred beneath the fear. Over the following weeks, Illyra began to notice more of these small contradictions. In public, the king was exactly as cruel as his reputation suggested, sharp-tongued in meetings, unwilling to explain his decisions, quick to end conversations with a single cold word. But she also saw him flinch, just slightly, whenever a certain village to the north was mentioned in his war council reports. She saw him give quiet orders to reduce taxes in regions recovering from past conflict, orders that were never announced publicly and were instead credited to his advisor, Lord Cassian Rook. Lord Rook was the king's closest advisor, a tall, composed man with a smooth voice and careful smile. He was always present at council meetings, always the one to explain the king's decisions to the court, always the one who seemed to benefit most whenever new wars were declared or new taxes were raised. Illyra found herself watching Rook more closely than she watched the king. One night, unable to sleep, she wandered the halls to clear her mind. She had been avoiding a forced meeting earlier that evening with a visiting lord who had made it clear he hoped to marry into royal favor through her, and the memory of his grasping hands still made her skin crawl. She walked without thinking, turning down corridors she had never explored, until she found herself standing before a heavy wooden door at the end of the west corridor. The locked room. Her heart pounded. She knew she should turn back, but something pulled her forward, and when she pressed her hand against the door, it creaked open. It had not been locked after all, not that night. Inside was not a chamber of punishment. It was a nursery. Dust covered everything, but Alira could see wooden toys carefully arranged on a shelf, small blankets folded on a narrow bed, and a portrait hanging above the fireplace. The portrait showed a woman with warm brown eyes and gentle features, holding an infant in her arms. Neither of them resembled anyone Alira had seen in the current royal court. She stood frozen, staring at the painting, when a voice behind her made her jump. "You shouldn't be here." King Draven stood in the doorway, his face pale in the candlelight. For the first time since she had arrived at Valemore, he did not look cold. He looked exhausted, and something close to afraid. Alira braced herself for punishment. Instead, the king closed the door softly behind him and sat down on the edge of the small bed, staring at the portrait as though he hadn't looked at it in a long time. "Her name was Queen Miriel," he said quietly, "the true queen of Valemore, and the child in her arms was the true heir to this throne." "I don't understand," Alira whispered. Draven was silent for a long moment before he spoke again. "I am not who the kingdom believes me to be. I was a child from a village near the northern border, an orphan with no family, and no name worth remembering. When the real royal family was killed in an uprising years ago, blamed on a rival house that had nothing to do with it, I was found and brought to the castle because I resembled the lost prince closely enough to convince the court. Lord Rook orchestrated it all. He needed a face to sit on the throne while he ruled from behind it." Alira's breath caught. The massacre, the one no one speaks of. "Rook ordered it," Draven said, his voice tight with old grief. "He wanted control of Valemore's wealth and army, but he needed a king the people would follow, and he could not simply declare himself ruler without a true bloodline. So he found me. He trained me to speak like royalty, to walk like royalty, and most of all, to appear as ruthless as the kingdom needed to fear, so that no one would dare challenge his rule through me. Every war, every harsh punishment blamed on the Wolf King, was ordered by Rook. I was never given the choice to refuse." "Then why do it? Why let the entire kingdom believe you are a monster?" Draven finally looked at her, his eyes glassy with years of buried anger. "Because the moment I step out of line, Rook exposes me as a fraud, and worse, he kills anyone who might listen to the truth. I have spent years trying to soften the damage where I can, quietly, without him noticing, reducing taxes when possible, sparing servants when I am able, but it is never enough, and I have had no way to stop him without destroying myself and everyone who might believe me." Alira looked at the portrait again, at the woman who should have raised her own child in this very room. Anger rose in her chest, sharper than her fear. "Then let me help you," she said. Draven stared at her as though she had spoken a foreign language. "You would be risking your life." "My life was already given away the moment my father signed those papers," Alira said. "At least let me choose what I risk it for." Over the following weeks, Alira became Draven's quiet ally. As one of the brides-to-be, no one suspected her of anything beyond nervous politeness. She used her small duties as cover, delivering messages, arranging meetings, and slowly gathering pieces of evidence that Draven could not safely collect himself. With Mira's help, she found an old steward who had served during the true royal family's reign and still remembered the night of the uprising. With careful questions during court gatherings, she uncovered financial records showing how Lord Rook's family had grown wealthier with every war waged under the Wolf King's name. It was dangerous work. More than once, Alira felt Rook's eyes linger on her a moment too long, as though he sensed something shifting beneath his careful control. But she pressed on, driven by the memory of a nursery frozen in time and a king who had been forced to wear a monster's mask since he was a child. Finally, the evidence was ready. A public assembly was called. one where Rook intended to formally announce Elira's betrothal to the king, believing it would further secure his influence over the throne through a controlled, grateful bride. Instead, when the hall fell silent and all eyes turned toward her, Elira stepped forward and spoke the truth. She told the gathered nobles, merchants, and soldiers of the true royal bloodline, murdered not by a rival house, but by Lord Rook's own hand. She presented the steward's testimony, the financial records, and the portrait from the nursery, carried carefully from the castle, and placed before the entire court. Gasps rippled through the hall. Rook's composed expression cracked for the first time, his eyes darting toward the exits. "This is a lie," he said, though his voice wavered. "A desperate girl's fantasy." But King Draven stepped forward then, and for the first time in years, he did not hide behind the mask he had been forced to wear. He confirmed every word, his voice steady despite the risk, describing the years of manipulation, the orders he had been forced to carry out, and the fear that had kept him silent. The court that had once trembled at the mention of the Wolf King now turned its fury toward the man who had truly earned that fear. Soldiers who had followed orders believing them to come from a ruthless king now understood who had truly been pulling the strings. Nobles who had quietly resented years of unexplained cruelty finally had someone to hold responsible. Rook attempted to flee the hall, but the guards, no longer certain who they were meant to protect, blocked his path. Within moments, he was seized, stripped of his title, and led away to await judgment for his crimes. The hall remained silent for a long time afterward, the weight of the truth settling over everyone present. Then, slowly, one by one, the nobles began to kneel, not to the Wolf King they had feared, but to the man beneath the title, who had endured years of forced cruelty, rather than surrender to it completely. In the months that followed, King Draven began the slow work of rebuilding what Rook had broken. Taxes were lowered honestly and openly. Villages that had suffered under old orders received support to recover. The nursery on the 3rd floor was finally cleaned and cared for, no longer a hidden secret, but a quiet memorial to the family who should have ruled Valemore. Elira could have left the castle then. Her family's debt had long since been forgiven, and she was free to return home if she wished. But when Draven asked her, quietly and without expectation, whether she wanted to stay, she found she already knew her answer. She had been sold to a man the kingdom called a monster. What she had found instead was someone who had spent his life trapped behind a mask he never chose, and the courage, finally, to remove it. This time, when she chose to stay by his side, it was not because a debt demanded it, or because a signature on a piece of paper had decided her fate. It was because, for the first time in her life, the choice was entirely her own.